The days leading up to the attack passed like the held breath of a dying man, long, stretched, and heavy with inevitability. Everyone on the ranch felt it. Even the cattle grew restless, lowing at night as though sensing the storm creeping closer. Clara found herself watching the horizon constantly. Every dust cloud stirred her nerves. Every bird startled from the brush felt like an omen. The Rucker gang wasn't just rumor anymore. They were coming. And the ranch, this fragile oasis of laughter and hope, was about to be tested. The first glimpse of riders, it was dawn when the world finally shifted. Clara had been up early, the revolver heavy at her hip as she fetched water from the pump. The cast sun was only a smear of pale light against the gray horizon when she noticed a dust trail rising far out on the plains. She froze, water sloshing down her skirt. There were riders, many riders. Her heart thudded painfully. She ran back to the house, skirts tangling, breath sharp in her chest. Ethan was already on the porch, rifle in hand, his jaw set like carved stone. He didn't ask what she'd seen. He already knew. They're here. Preparing for the siege. The children were ushered into the cellar, their frightened questions hushed by Clara's steady voice. She knelt with them in the dim light, her hands trembling as she brushed hair back from small faces, forcing herself to smile. "You'll be safe here," she told them. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay quiet and you stay brave. Do you understand?" The oldest boy nodded, his face pale but determined. The youngest clung to Clara's skirt. She hugged them all quickly, fiercely, then climbed back up the ladder into the storm of reality. Outside, Ethan was already laying out rifles and ammunition on the table. His movements were calm, deliberate. Clara's fear might have unraveled her, but his quiet steadiness anchored her. "Take the left side of the porch," he said, sliding a revolver toward her. "They'll try to circle around." Clara swallowed hard, fingers closing around the cold metal. "How many do you think?" "More than enough." The outlaws arrive. The thunder of hooves grew louder until it was a roar that shook the earth itself. Then they appeared, black silhouettes cresting the ridge, torches blazing in their fists, their whoops and curses carried on the wind like the cries of devils. The Rucker gang. There were at least 20 of them, faces twisted with greed and vengeance, horses kicking up great plumes of dust. At their head rode Caleb Rucker himself, broad-shouldered and cruel, his long coat whipping in the wind. His eyes locked on the ranch house like a hawk on prey. "McGraw!" he bellowed as his riders fanned out. "You made a mistake crossing." "Us! Tonight we burn it all down!" Ethan didn't answer. He simply raised his rifle, braced against his shoulder, and fired. One of the outlaws dropped from his saddle before Caleb had even finished speaking. The battle began. Gunfire and firelight. The first volley of bullets shattered the quiet dawn. Clara flinched as wood splintered beside her head, chips stinging her cheek. She forced herself to steady her breath, to remember Ethan's instructions. She sighted down the barrel, squeezed the trigger. The crack of her revolver echoed across the yard. An outlaw who had been rushing with a torch pitched backward off his horse. The flames snuffed in the dirt. Clara's stomach twisted, but she had no time for hesitation. Another rider was already spurring forward. The porch became a fortress of thunder. Ethan's rifle barked with deadly precision, each shot deliberate, each outlaw who dared too close falling in a cloud of dust. Clara covered the flank, her hands shaking, but her aim finding its mark when it mattered. The air grew thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Horses screamed, men cursed, torches flew through the air, some smashing against the barn, flames licking at the dry wood. Clara's heart hammered as fire spread along the fence line, smoke curling black into the morning sky. "They'll burn us out!" she shouted. Ethan reloaded calmly, his face streaked with sweat and soot. Then we hold them until the sheriff comes, or we don't hold at all. A desperate stand. The gang pressed harder, circling, firing from all sides. Clara ducked as a bullet whistled past her ear, her breath ragged. She fired back, watching an outlaw tumble, his horse veering wild. But for every man that fell, two more seemed to take his place. Clara's arms ached. Her ears rang from the constant barrage. Still, she refused to falter. Every time fear clawed at her, she thought of the children huddled in the cellar. She thought of the small hand that had once taken hers, of the trust in their eyes. She would not let them be taken. At one point, an outlaw broke through, galloping close with a torch raised high. Clara's heart seized. She fired once, twice, missed both. The flames streaking nearer, then Ethan's rifle cracked and the rider crumpled, torch falling harmlessly into the dirt. Focus. Ethan's voice cut through the chaos, calm even in fire. Breathe. Don't waste shots. Clara nodded, breath trembling, and steadied herself. This was no longer about fear. It was about survival, about protecting the family she had found. The sheriff's arrival. The fight raged for what felt like hours, though it was, surely minutes. Just when Clara's revolver clicked empty and despair threatened to choke her, a new sound cut through the chaos, the sharp, commanding crack of more rifles. From the ridge beyond the pastures, riders thundered down. The sheriff, pale and bandaged but unbroken, had rallied a posse. Farmers, ranchers, townsfolk, they came with rifles and fury, their own homes having suffered too long under the Rucker gang's reign. The outlaws, caught between two fires, faltered. Some tried to flee, others fought on desperately. Caleb Rucker himself roared curses, firing wildly as he wheeled his horse. Ethan's rifle barked one last time, and Caleb toppled from his saddle, crashing into the dust. The gang's will broke. The survivors scattered across the plains, chased by the sheriff's posse. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of dying flames and the ragged breathing of the defenders. Aftermath. Clara lowered her revolver, her hands shaking violently now that the danger had passed. Smoke stung her eyes as she stumbled down the porch steps. Bodies lay strewn across the yard, the dirt stained dark. It was over. Ethan stood tall amidst the wreckage, rifle still in his hand, his chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. His eyes swept the horizon, then the house, then finally her. "You did good," he said simply. The cellar door burst open and the children spilled out, running into the yard, crying, clinging to Clara and Ethan both. Clara dropped to her knees, arms wrapping around them, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face. She held them close, heart swelling with relief and fierce love. She had never given birth, but in that moment she knew with every fiber of her being, she was a mother, a future reborn. In the days that followed, the ranch became a place of rebuilding. Neighbors came to help mend fences, to put out the last embers, to bury the dead. Red Hollow breathed again, its people no longer cowering. Under the shadow of the Rucker gang, Clara moved through it all with new strength. The children clung to her, looked to her not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged. And Ethan, quiet Ethan, remained steady at her side, his presence a constant anchor. One evening, when the repairs were finally done and the cattle grazed, peacefully again, Clara stood with Ethan on the porch, watching the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson. "You were told once you couldn't be a mother," Ethan said softly, his eyes on the horizon. "But blood doesn't make family. Choice does." Clara's throat tightened. She turned to him, her heart full. "And you? Why did you choose me?" He met her gaze, steady as ever, but his voice carried something deeper now, something unguarded. "Because you fight for them. Because you fight for hope. Because you make this place feel like home again." The children's laughter drifted from the yard, mingling with the song of crickets. Clara slipped her hand into Ethan's, rough and gentle all at once. For years she had believed herself broken, cast aside, unwanted. But here, with a quiet rancher and the children they had fought to protect, she saw a different future, one not built on what she lacked, but on what she had found, and it was more than enough. The storm that had torn across Red Hollow left the town trembling in its wake. For 2 days, the streets smelled of gunpowder and wet earth, the air still charged with the echoes of violence. Windows were boarded up, bullet holes patched, and the saloon swept its floors twice over, but fear clung to the town like smoke. The sheriff lay wounded in his office, his deputy stretched thin, trying to keep order. People whispered of how close they'd come to losing everything. The Rucker gang had tested the town's strength and found it weak. Clara hadn't forgotten the sight of Ethan McGraw stepping into the gunfire with his rifle steady, nor the way he had pulled her behind him with a touch that was both protective and respectful, not a command but a shield. That night replayed in her mind every time she closed her eyes, the roar of thunder, the flash of lightning on steel, the calm in his voice as the world fell apart around them. When he offered her shelter at his ranch, she hesitated. She had come to Red Hollow to prove she could stand on her own. Accepting help felt like admitting weakness. But the thought of her narrow, rented room above the store, alone and vulnerable, with the Rucker gang still at large, it silenced her pride. She said yes. The ranch on the edge of the Plains Ethan's ranch lay several miles beyond town, where the land opened wide into rolling grass and the sky stretched so far it seemed to swallow time. The trail wound past fences battered by wind and weather, through stretches of wild sage and mesquite. Clara sat in the wagon beside Ethan, her satchel on her lap, the silence between them filled only by the creak of wood and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. She wanted to speak, to thank him properly, but words tangled on her tongue. He seemed content with the quiet, eyes fixed on the horizon, as though he saw something out there beyond the reach of ordinary folk. The ranch itself was simple but solid, a 2-story house of weathered wood, its porch sagging slightly but sturdy enough. Barns stretched out behind, and beyond them the vast pastures rolled into the distance, dotted with cattle grazing under the restless sky. But what caught Clara by surprise was not the land or the house. It was the children. They came tumbling out as the wagon rolled up. 3 boys and 2 girls, their clothes patched but clean, their faces bright despite the dust and work that had surely filled their day. They crowded around Ethan like chicks to a hen, tugging at his sleeves, shouting over one another to tell him of chores finished and chores left undone. Clara blinked. She had expected loneliness here. Silence. Instead, the air was alive with laughter and questions. "Who's she?" asked the eldest boy, a gangly youth of 12 with hair the color of sun-bleached straw. His tone was blunt, but not unkind. "This is Miss Dawson," Ethan said, climbing down from the wagon. "She'll be staying with us for a while." The children regarded her with open curiosity. Clara, unused to such attention, offered a small smile. The youngest girl, no more than 5, darted forward and took her hand without hesitation. Clara felt the small fingers curl trustingly around hers, and something deep inside her, something she had thought long dead, stirred awake. A different kind of family over supper. Clara learned the truth. These were not Ethan's children. None of them bore his eyes or his jaw. "They're orphans," he said simply, spooning stew into bowls with the same calm matter-of-factness he carried into everything. "Families lost to fever, raids, accidents, some left behind after the war. I couldn't see them go hungry." Clara's spoon hovered in her hand. In Missouri, people had whispered that her worth was gone because she could not give life. Yet here was a man who had built a family not from blood, but from choice. He had taken what the world cast aside and given it shelter, given it love. That night, lying in the small guest room with the sound of crickets drifting through the open window. Clara stared at the ceiling and thought of the children's faces. Their laughter had followed her up the stairs, bright and unashamed. She thought of the youngest girl's hand in hers. And she thought of Ethan, quiet at the head of the table, not boasting or seeking praise, just steady like the earth itself. Days on the ranch life on the McGraw Ranch settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and healing. Clara rose at dawn, with the children, helped fetch water from the pump, mended torn clothes, stirred porridge, and brushed tangles from hair. Later, she kept the books, her steady hand turning numbers into order for Ethan's cattle sales. The land was harsh, but it gave back to those who respected it. She watched Ethan move through his days with tireless resolve, mending fences, driving cattle, teaching the boys to shoot straight and the girls to ride strong. He said little, but the children leaned into his silences, as if they understood. His heart even when his lips stayed still. Clara had thought herself broken, yet in this place she felt needed. Not because of what she could not give, but because of what she already carried. Patience, steadiness, the ability to soothe a crying child, to keep order where chaos threatened. The children began to seek her out, climbing into her lap with scraped knees, asking for stories at night. And she gave freely, without the hollow ache that had once consumed her. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the plains, she stood on the porch with Ethan. The children played in the yard, chasing one another through the tall grass. "You've built something here," she said softly. Ethan rested his hands on the railing, gaze fixed on the horizon. "Just trying to give them a chance." "You've given them more than that," she whispered, but he said nothing, only nodded slightly as if her words were both a burden and a balm. Shadows gathering, but peace in the west was never meant to. Last word reached the ranch by way of a peddler passing through. The Rucker gang had been humiliated in Red Hollow, losing 2 men in their raid. They weren't the kind to let such things go unanswered. Folks whispered that Ethan McGraw's ranch was next, that the gang meant to make an example of the quiet man who had dared to stand against them. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, watching the dark fields, every creak of the old house a threat. The children slept soundly down the hall, unaware. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, oiling his rifle with calm, methodical strokes. "They'll come," he said without looking up, as though speaking her thoughts aloud. Clara's hands clenched on the windowsill. "And when they do?" Ethan looked. Up then, his eyes steady in the lamplight. "Then we fight." The choice Clara had never held a gun in her life. Back in Missouri, women were expected to tend the home, not defend it. But the frontier was not Missouri. Out here, a woman who couldn't fight was a woman who wouldn't last. The next morning, Ethan placed a revolver in her hands. It was heavy, the metal cold against her skin. "You don't have to," he said quietly. But she looked past him to where the children were chasing one another in the yard, laughter ringing like bells. She thought of the life she had lost, the years spent believing herself useless. And then she thought of the small hand that had clutched hers, the trust of a child who saw no flaw in her. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I do." Ethan's eyes searched hers, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker there. Approval, perhaps, or something deeper, something he wasn't ready to name. He showed her how to load the revolver, how to aim, how to steady her breath before the shot. She listened, learned, practiced until her arms ached. Each pull of the trigger was a defiance, not against the Rucker gang alone, but against every voice that had ever told her she was less than whole. The calm before the storm, the days that followed, were taut with tension, each sunrise a question. Would they come today? Each dusk a small reprieve. The children sensed it, though they didn't understand. Their games were quieter, their laughter edged with unease. Clara kept her fear hidden, but at night she prayed silently. For courage, for strength, for the chance to protect what she had found here. One evening, as they repaired a section of fence, Ethan paused and looked at her. The setting sun painted his face in firelight, lines of weariness etched deep. "You've got more grit than most men I've known," he said. Clara blinked, startled. Praise had been foreign to her for so long. She met his eyes, her voice quiet, but firm. "I've had to." They held each other's gaze for a long moment. Then Ethan nodded once, as though acknowledging not just her words, but everything unspoken between them. The storm was coming. They both felt it, and when it broke, it would decide everything. The stagecoach rattled down the last stretch of dirt road leading into Red Hollow, its wheels grinding against rocks and sending up clouds of dust that hung in the air like smoke. The driver, a sunburned man with cracked lips, flicked the reins, sharply, urging the tired horses into one last burst of speed. The frontier town lay ahead, crouched under a burning sky that had baked the earth into a hard, brittle crust. Clara Dawson sat stiff-backed inside, her gloved hands clamped tightly around a worn satchel that held all she owned. Every bump of the wheels jolted through her body, but it wasn't the rough ride that had her heart knotted tight. It was the whispers she knew would greet her the moment her boots touched Red Hollow's dirt street. She had lived with whispers for years. She could still hear the doctor's voice back in Missouri, flat and final. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Dawson. The damage is permanent. You will never bear children." At first, Clara had fought the words. Doctors were not God. Perhaps he was wrong. But as months passed, then years, the truth hardened. The marriage that had once been filled with laughter and whispered dreams began to wither. Her husband, Aaron, grew restless, resentful. The house echoed with silence where a child's cry should have been. Until one morning he packed his things, left a note on the table, and never came back. Her parents told her to remarry, but the men of her town wanted heirs, not barren wives. She became poor Clara Dawson, the woman who couldn't give a man what he needed. Doors closed, eyes turned away. So she had left it all behind. Missouri, Aaron, the pitying looks, the endless reminders. She had boarded the stage and set, her sights west toward Red Hollow, a place where no one knew her name, where the land was wild enough to swallow past mistakes. The coach jolted to a stop in front of the town's main street. The driver muttered, "Red Hollow," and swung. "Open the door." Clara stepped down, her skirts brushing against the dirt, the heat instantly pressing against her skin. The town looked like every tale she had ever heard of the frontier. False front buildings standing shoulder to shoulder, paint peeling under the relentless sun. A saloon with swinging doors creaked in the breeze, its windows clouded with dust. The blacksmith's hammer rang from somewhere down the street, a harsh counterpoint to the murmur of voices drifting from the general store. But there was something else in the air, too. A tension that vibrated beneath the ordinary bustle. Men stood with their hats low, hands never far from their belts. Women hurried their children along. On every wall, yellowed posters flapped in the hot wind. She stopped to read one. Wanted, the Rucker Gang, dead or alive, $500 reward. The sketches were crude, but the eyes of the outlaws glared from the paper with feral cruelty. Clara felt a shiver despite the heat. She tucked her satchel closer to her side and walked on. The general store sat near the center of town, and it was there Clara found her first bit of work. The owner, Mr. Barlow, was a thick-bellied man with a beard that seemed to bristle at every breath. He squinted at her when she asked for work, muttered something about needing help with ledgers and stock, and finally waved her toward the crates, stacked in the back. It wasn't glamorous work, but Clara threw herself into it. Numbers had always been a safe harbor for her, and in the store's ledgers she found order when her heart felt adrift. Still, she noticed the looks, the way women glanced at her when she passed, whispering behind their hands. It didn't take long for the town to learn her story. Out here, news traveled faster than the stage, but Red Hollow was too preoccupied with its own troubles to dwell long on one woman's misfortune. The Rucker gang had been hitting ranches for weeks, stealing cattle, torching barns, and leaving blood in their wake. The sheriff, a gaunt man named Tom Evers, tried to stand against them, but he was only one man with a single deputy, stretched thin across miles of land. Folks spoke of the Ruckers in the saloon with tight jaws and low voices. No rancher slept easy. Clara listened. She learned the rhythm of the town, the way fear lived in every corner. She told herself she had come west for a fresh start, yet the air here was thick with danger. But then, so was life everywhere. It was in the general store that she first noticed Ethan McGraw. He was a tall man, lean but broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and a quiet presence that filled the room without effort. His hair was streaked with gray, though he couldn't have been much past 40, and his eyes, clear, steady, a shade between gray and blue, were the kind that looked straight through the noise of a world. He spoke little, usually just enough, to ask for supplies or give thanks. Yet there was a gentleness in the way he handed over coins, in the way he nodded to Clara as though she were more than just another clerk behind a counter. She noticed his hands first. Calloused, scarred, the hands of a man who worked the land from dawn until dark. But they weren't cruel hands. When he picked up a sack of flour or a crate of nails, it was with careful strength, as if even objects deserved respect. The townsfolk said little about him beyond the basics. He had lost his wife some years back, lived alone on a ranch a few miles out, kept mostly to himself. A quiet man, they said. A good man. Clara found herself looking forward to the days he came in, though she told herself it meant nothing. She had no use for such feelings. That part of her life was over. Still, she remembered the first time his eyes met hers. Truly met. Hers. She was setting a jar of beans on the shelf, struggling with the height, when he stepped forward silently and lifted it with ease. "Here," he murmured, his voice low and even. Their fingers brushed for the briefest second. She felt a jolt run through her chest, sharp as a spark from flint. And then he was gone, the door creaking shut behind him. The weeks passed. Clara settled into her work, learned the faces of the town, and tried to carve out a place for herself. Yet always, there lingered that quiet presence of Ethan McGraw, like the shadow of a tree she hadn't realized she'd been standing under. Then came the night the Rucker gang rode into Red Hollow. The evening had been unsettled from the start. Clouds gathered over the plains, rolling dark and heavy, swallowing the horizon. The air smelled of rain and iron, the promise of a storm. Clara was walking home from the store, her satchel over her arm, when the first thunder cracked like a rifle across the canyon. And then came the riders. They thundered into town with whoops and curses, revolvers blazing, windows shattered, horses reared, men dove for cover. Clara froze in the middle of the street, her breath caught in her throat. She had seen violence before in whispers and tales, but never with her own eyes. The outlaws' faces twisted in the flare of gunfire, shadows leaping across the walls. One of them saw her. A grin split his face as he spurred his horse toward her, pistol raised. Clara couldn't move. Her legs rooted to the ground as the world narrowed to the gleam of that gun, and then a voice, low and calm, cut through the chaos. "Stay behind me." Ethan McGraw stepped from the shadows of an alley, rifle already braced against his shoulder. His eyes locked on the rider. The crack of his shot split the night, and the outlaw tumbled from his saddle into the dust. Another rider veered toward them, firing wild. Ethan didn't flinch. He moved with steady precision, pulling Clara back behind him as he fired again. The second man fell. The storm broke overhead, rain lashing down, mingling with the smoke of gunpowder. Clara clutched Ethan's arm, heart hammering as the town erupted in battle. For the first time since she had left Missouri, since the day she had been told she was broken, Clara Dawson felt something stir inside her. Not fear, not despair. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope.